The door of the elegant restaurant slowly opened, and a chilly late afternoon breeze entered, along with an elderly woman with a serene look and humble posture. Margaret, dressed in a simple coat and carrying a worn-out bag, carefully walked up to the counter, where the well-dressed customers barely noticed her. Jake, the young waiter, looked up as he adjusted his vest, eyeing her from head to toe with a hint of disdain. He was used to serving executives, wealthy couples, and women adorned with shiny jewelry, not someone like her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight arrogance. Margaret, with a shy smile, calmly responded, "I'd like a table, please." Jake, unable to hide his disdain, glanced around as if the luxurious tables were meant for anyone but her. "Are you sure?" he said, leaning over the counter. "This place isn't exactly affordable." Margaret didn't seem bothered, keeping her tone gentle. "Yes, I know. I'd like to have dinner here." Jake forced a smile, but inside, he had already decided that she didn't belong there. "I can tell you won't spend much here," he thought, though he didn't say it out loud. The waiter, in no hurry, offered her a table near the kitchen, a spot where he could hide the customers he considered out of place for the restaurant. Meanwhile, Margaret sat down patiently, as if she were used to waiting longer than necessary. Jake, believing she would quickly leave or order something cheap, barely bothered to hand her the menu with any respect. He didn't know, but his every move was being watched by other customers, who were wondering why such a simple woman had chosen such an expensive place. Yet Jake ignored everyone. Jake returned to the counter slowly, his eyes quickly reverting to ignoring Margaret's presence. He seemed more interested in attending to the customers with full wallets, the people he deemed worthy of attention in such a high-end restaurant. The elderly woman, now seated near the kitchen, still waited for the menu with the same calmness, her eyes observing the details around her, as if it had been a long time since she had been in a place like that. When Jake finally decided to bring the menu to the table, his posture was rigid, almost indifferent. "Here you go," he said, without even making eye contact with Margaret. His tone was cold, laden with an arrogance that was barely concealed. Margaret thanked him softly, opening the menu with care, while Jake quickly walked away, as if the simple act of serving that woman was a waste of time. His mind was filled with certainty that she would order something simple and cheap, if she even ordered at all. Around them, a few customers began to notice the differentiated treatment. Quiet whispers filled the air. A younger couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing that something was out of the ordinary. That restaurant was known for its excellent service, and Jake had always seemed proud to serve with perfection. But now, facing a woman who didn't exude wealth, his behavior was the opposite. Jake's silent disdain became visible with each gesture, each word he avoided saying. Margaret, on the other hand, maintained her composure. There was no anger in her eyes, only a patience that contrasted with the growing tension in the air around her. It was as if she was already used to being underestimated, to being seen as less. But Jake didn't see that. To him, the situation was simple. This wasn't her place. And as he went about his routine, serving the other customers with his usual forced smile, Margaret continued to observe, her calm gaze hiding something deeper. She knew that what was happening was more than just a simple meal, and Jake, in his arrogance, was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Margaret gently closed the menu and, lifting her eyes, looked for Jake. He was cheerfully chatting with a well-dressed couple, who laughed at something he had said, completely unaware of her presence. She waited patiently, but as the minutes passed, it became clear that Jake wasn't in a hurry to return. He had seen her, of course, but had decided to ignore her. Slowly, the discomfort of the nearby customers began to grow. It wasn't just the neglect, but the almost cruel way he made her wait, as if she were invisible. When Jake finally returned to the table, the forced smile he used with the other customers had completely disappeared. "Have you decided what you're going to order?" he asked in a mechanical tone. Margaret, without losing her composure, made a simple request that required careful preparation. Jake frowned, as if surprised that she had chosen something beyond the cheapest dish. Without responding, he carelessly scribbled down the order and hurried off, not looking back, leaving a sense of humiliation lingering in the air. That brief, indifferent exchange did not go unnoticed. A man sitting at the table next to hers observed the scene with a furrowed brow, exchanging glances with his wife. The silence at Margaret's table seemed to heighten the tension in the air, and even those who tried not to pay attention began to feel uneasy with the waiter's behavior. Jake, however, didn't seem to care. To him, Margaret was just a mistake in the restaurant's perfect scene, an insignificant distraction. When Margaret's order arrived, Jake placed it on the table with a brusque, almost careless gesture. She, however, thanked him in the same polite tone as always, without showing any signs of offense or outrage. Her calm irritated Jake in a way he couldn't explain. His pride blinded him to the dignity that Margaret maintained even under the weight of his humiliation. To Jake, she was just another person he would never see again, or at least that's what he thought. The restaurant was busier than usual that night, but the mood among the customers had changed. The laughter and low conversations gave way to an uncomfortable silence that hung over the tables around Margaret. Jake's behavior, tolerated up until then, began to attract concerned looks. Some customers whispered among themselves, visibly uncomfortable with how he was treating her. Despite this, no one had the courage to intervene. Margaret, however, remained as she always had, calm and serene. Her gestures were delicate, each movement demonstrating a rare patience. It was as if she knew that this moment wasn't the end of something, but the beginning. Her silence, filled with dignity, contrasted with Jake's growing impatience, who now made it a point to completely ignore her. He served the other tables with forced smiles, but his disdain for the elderly woman was obvious to anyone who cared to notice. It was in this tense atmosphere that the kitchen door swung open, and Sarah, a restaurant employee, hurried into the dining area. She had just come from the office and seemed distracted, but when her eyes met Margaret's, a look of surprise and joy spread across her face. Without hesitation, Sarah crossed the room, passing the tables with quick, determined steps until she reached the table where Margaret was sitting. "Mrs. Margaret," Sarah exclaimed, her voice breaking the awkward silence that had settled over the room. The sound of her voice made several nearby customers pause and look in their direction. Sarah smiled warmly, bending down to greet Margaret with a respectful hug, making it clear that this elderly woman was not just any customer. She was known, and it seemed deeply respected by those who worked at the restaurant. Jake, watching from a distance, froze. The smile on his face slowly faded as he tried to understand what was happening. His mind raced in different directions, but the discomfort in his stomach grew. Why did Sarah, who barely spoke to customers, seem so close to this woman? The tension in the restaurant shifted to anticipation, and all eyes were now on Sarah and Margaret. Margaret returned Sarah's hug with a calm smile, showing no sign of the humiliation Jake had tried to impose. She knew that this moment would change everything, and Sarah's presence brought to light something that, until then, had been hidden between the lines. But Jake still didn't understand what was about to happen, and when the truth came to light, he would realize that the woman he had humiliated was far more important than he could ever have imagined. The silence in the restaurant became palpable as curious eyes followed every movement of Sarah and Margaret. Jake, across the room, felt a chill run down his spine, an unease he couldn't ignore. His hands were sweating, and he began piecing together a puzzle that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Something was wrong, and he was beginning to feel that he had terribly underestimated this woman. Sarah, still smiling, glanced around, noticing the surprised looks of the customers and staff. She then turned to Jake, who stood motionless, as if frozen in place. With a more serious expression, she paused before saying something that would make his heart sink. "Jake, do you know who Mrs. Margaret is?" Her voice, though calm, echoed like thunder in the waiter's ears. He was speechless, the words stuck in his throat. The silence was broken by Margaret herself, who, with the same calm as always, looked directly at Jake and said in a soft voice, but laden with meaning. "Jake, I am David's mother, the owner of this restaurant." The world around Jake crumbled at that moment. The sentence echoed in his mind, as if each word were being repeated 1,000 times. David's mother, the owner of the restaurant he had so despised, the woman he had humiliated without a second thought. The expressions of surprise from the customers around were a reflection of the shock taking over Jake. The air in the restaurant, once filled with a constant murmur, was now heavy, laden with tension. Jake's face turned pale, his body stiffened, and his mind went into panic mode. He finally understood the extent of his mistake, and the shame overwhelmed him like an avalanche. David, the restaurant owner, had just arrived and was watching the scene from afar. When his eyes met his mother's, concern filled his face. He knew that look and understood that something serious had happened. Upon noticing Jake's presence, David walked toward him with firm steps. Each beat of Jake's heart seemed louder than the last, and he felt as if the ground might give way beneath his feet at any moment. When he got closer, David looked at Jake with a fury that he didn't bother to hide. "Is this how you treat my customers, Jake? Is this how you treat my mother?" David's words were as sharp as knives, cutting through the silence. Jake tried to speak, but his voice failed. There were no excuses, no justifications for what he had done. Shame and fear were now his only companions. Margaret, on the other hand, remained calm, her eyes fixed on Jake, but without malice. She knew the most difficult moment was yet to come. As Jake sank under the weight of his guilt, everyone in the restaurant waited anxiously for David's decision. Jake, filled with regret, knew that he was about to lose much more than just his job. The silence in the restaurant was almost deafening as David stared at Jake with eyes full of restrained anger. The tension between the two was palpable, and the environment, once elegant and sophisticated, was now filled with a heavy energy. Jake, with his body tense and hands trembling, couldn't say a word. He knew that what was coming next would be nothing short of a disaster for him. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" David's voice, low and controlled, was more terrifying than if he had shouted. Each word was spoken with a fury so intense that it made Jake shrink. The customers around them watched in silence, as if they were witnessing a spectacle they couldn't look away from. Margaret, still seated at the table, observed the scene calmly, though there was a seriousness in her gaze. Jake tried to open his mouth, muttering something incoherent. "Sir, I didn't know," he stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. David had no patience for his excuses. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his voice rising only slightly. "You didn't know that the woman you humiliated, that you treated with disdain, is my mother?" The word mother came out loaded with weight, and Jake felt the shame burn him from within. David took a step forward, making it clear to everyone that he would not tolerate what had happened. "I can't allow someone like you to continue working here. You dishonored my mother and this restaurant. You're fired, Jake. Now." The sentence was swift and cruel, like a precise blow. Jake's heart raced, and despair consumed him. He knew that his arrogance and prejudice had brought him to this point, but panic prevented him from thinking clearly. Before Jake could react, Margaret gently raised her hand, but firmly. "David, please wait." Her voice, calm and controlled, cut through the air like an unexpected breeze. All eyes turned to her, including David's, who seemed surprised by his mother's intervention. Jake, still in shock, looked at Margaret with pleading eyes, as if she were his last chance for redemption. Margaret gestured for David to come closer, and when he did, she said, "I'd like to talk to Jake before any final decision is made." There was something in her voice that made the people around feel that she had much more to say. David hesitated for a moment, clearly furious, but he couldn't ignore his mother's request. "All right, Mom," he said reluctantly, "but I'm not changing my mind." Margaret smiled slightly, knowing that this would be a crucial moment. As silence settled back over the restaurant, everyone present waited anxiously for what would happen next. Jake, now standing before Margaret, felt smaller than ever, but at the same time, The hope for a second chance was beginning to form in his chest. The restaurant, once buzzing with the sound of conversations and laughter, was now enveloped in an almost reverent silence. All eyes were fixed on Margaret, who had requested to speak at the moment Jake thought he had lost everything. She walked slowly to a reserved table in the corner, gesturing softly for Jake to follow. Reluctantly, but with no other options, he walked behind her, the weight of shame pressing on his chest. He knew that the humiliation he had caused was returning to him twofold. Margaret sat down and indicated that Jake should do the same. There was something in her tranquility that made Jake feel small and, at the same time, desperate for redemption. He tried to formulate words of apology, but she interrupted him with a simple gesture. "Before you say anything, Jake, I want to tell you a story," she began, her voice gentle but full of meaning. Jake, swallowing hard, nodded. Margaret looked at him with the same eyes that, minutes earlier, he had underestimated. "When I was young, much younger than you, I was judged by my appearance more times than I can count." There was a restrained pain in her words, but it wasn't bitter. "I worked as a maid in restaurants like this one. I never had money to eat in the places I served. I saw the same looks of disdain that you gave me today." Jake, who at first had kept his eyes on the floor, now looked directly at Margaret, feeling the weight of her words. He saw something there that he couldn't see before, a story of struggle and overcoming. Margaret continued, "People saw me the way you saw me today. Just a simple woman, of no value. They ignored me, humiliated me, and, like you, they forgot that behind every appearance, there is a story. And my story changed. Everyone's story changes." She paused, allowing her words to sink deeply into Jake. He began to realize that, although he had treated Margaret as inferior, she was offering him something he didn't deserve: compassion. "Jake," she continued, "the people you serve, the ones you disdain, each of them has value, even if you don't see it at first. The biggest lesson I learned was that respect should never be measured by appearance or money. If you understand that, maybe you can grow from today." Margaret's words were like a wave of humility washing over Jake. For the first time in his life, he found himself disarmed, vulnerable. I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice choked. "I know I was wrong. I just wanted to be part of this place. I felt pressured. I thought that if I acted like them, I could be respected." He looked at Margaret with tearful eyes, hoping for a condemnation that never came. Margaret, with a slight smile, placed her hand over his. "We all make mistakes, Jake. But what's most important is what we do after those mistakes." She looked deeply into his eyes, and Jake felt that, as difficult as it was, he had a choice. The respect you're seeking, you can already find if you start seeing others as equals. Now, the decision is in my son's hands, but I believe in second chances. Jake remained silent for a moment, his trembling hands resting on the table as he absorbed every word Margaret had said. He had always believed that, to be respected, he needed to follow the invisible rules of those already at the top. Treat the powerful well, disdain the weak. But now, sitting face to face with the woman he had humiliated, this perception shattered before him. The regret weighed on his chest like an anchor, and for the first time, he felt that he wasn't simply fighting to keep his job. He was fighting to rediscover his humanity. "I don't know what to say." Jake finally managed to speak, his voice weak and choked. He had never felt so vulnerable. "I have no excuses for what I did. I always thought that's how I should act, that appearances were what mattered most." He lowered his head, unable to meet Margaret's gaze, as if his shame was too great to face. Margaret, with her infinite patience, remained serene. "We all learn something, Jake. Life teaches us, in harsh ways, that what seems important isn't always what really matters. But what matters now is not what you did, but what you'll do with this lesson." Her words carried a wisdom that only time and hard experiences could give. Jake felt the weight of truth in each one of them, and tears began to well up in his eyes. He looked at Margaret, seeking something he didn't know if he deserved. "I want to change," he said, almost in a whisper. "I'm not that arrogant, man. I know I can be better than this. Just give me a chance, please." There was a raw sincerity in his words that echoed through the restaurant. And for a brief moment, even the customers around, who had been watching the scene unfold, felt the depth of that request. Margaret sighed softly, as if considering all of Jake's words, weighing the impact of his actions. "Jake," she began, "I believe in second chances. I believe that everyone has the capacity to change, to redeem themselves. But change has to come from within. It's not enough to just apologize to save a job. You need to reflect on who you want to be from now on." She looked at him with an almost maternal sweetness, but there was a firmness in her words. Jake felt it as an ultimatum, not imposed by anger, but by wisdom. He knew that, from then on, his actions would need to match the regret he was expressing now. The silent tears running down his face were proof that he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. Margaret slowly stood up, her calm and imposing presence filling the space. "I will speak with my son," she said, her eyes fixed on Jake. "But more than that, I hope you will earn this second chance. Not for me, but for yourself." Jake nodded, speechless, as he watched Margaret walk toward David, who was waiting near the counter, still with a look of anger and indignation. As she approached David, Jake realized that this moment would change his life forever. And even though he still feared for the future, there was a spark of hope lit inside him. The chance to start again, to be a better person. Now, everything depended on how he would follow that path. Jake watched with a heavy heart as Margaret walked toward David. The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, and all eyes were fixed on that scene, waiting for the outcome of a situation that had started as a simple mistake, but had now turned into a turning point in Jake's life. He felt the weight of regret, the heat of shame still burning his face. But within him, there was also a glimpse of hope. Margaret had given him the chance to redeem himself, and he knew that this would be his last opportunity. David, upon seeing his mother approach, furrowed his brow, still visibly irritated by what had happened. His eyes met Jake's for a moment, and the anger on his face was unmistakable. "Mom, you don't need to intervene in this," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "This waiter showed who he really is. He deserves to be fired." The harsh words echoed through the dining room, and Jake felt his heart sink. He knew that, without Margaret, he would already be dismissed. But Margaret, with her unshakable calm, placed a gentle hand on David's arm. "David," she began, her voice firm but serene, "sometimes people make mistakes, serious mistakes, yes, but that doesn't mean they can't change." David looked at her in confusion, clearly shaken by the request. "He humiliated you, Mom. How can you defend him?" Margaret smiled lightly, not breaking eye contact with her son. "I'm not defending what he did," she explained, "but I'm defending the possibility that he can be someone better. Everyone deserves a second chance when they are truly sorry." Margaret's words carried the weight of her wisdom and experience. David, though hesitant, knew that his mother never spoke without deeply reflecting on what was fair. Jake, who had been watching from a distance, could no longer contain his emotion. He took a step forward, his voice coming out in a tone almost suffocated by guilt. "Mr. David, please hear me out," he began, looking directly into the restaurant owner's eyes, though his voice trembled as he remembered what he had said to Margaret. "I made a terrible mistake. I have no excuses. I was arrogant. I was cruel, and I let my pride blind me." With each word, his throat tightened, but he knew he needed to speak with an open heart. "I treated your mother in an unforgivable way," he continued, his voice now choked. "But I'm not that person you saw today. I can be better, and I want to be better. Just give me the chance to prove that I can change." Jake could no longer hide the tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he was vulnerable, stripped of any pretension, in front of everyone. The entire restaurant observed that scene, and the silence around increased the gravity of the moment. David looked at Jake for a long moment. The anger still burned in his eyes, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. He didn't want to forgive what Jake had done, but Margaret's compassion deeply moved him. With a heavy sigh, he finally looked at his mother. "Do you really think he deserves a second chance?" David asked, his voice soft but full of emotion. Margaret nodded slowly, with a gentle smile. "I believe, David. Not for me, but for him, because that's what makes a difference in the world. Giving someone the opportunity to grow from their mistakes." David, still reluctant, turned to Jake. "Very well," he said, his voice firm but less harsh than before. "I'll give you a second chance, Jake, but it won't be easy. You'll have to prove that you can be better than this." Jake, unable to contain his emotion, simply nodded, his gratitude overflowing with each tear that fell from his eyes. I'm very thankful, sir, and I promise I'll make this chance worth it," Jake responded, his voice still choked with emotion. And in that instant, he knew that this was the beginning of a new phase in his life. A phase where humility, respect, and regret would be his guides. Jake still stood, feeling the weight of David's words, but at the same time, an immense relief washed over him. He had been forgiven. He had received the chance he had so desperately begged for, a chance to start over. But he knew that this new phase wouldn't be easy. David's gaze, firm and full of expectations, made it clear that Jake would have to prove every word he had said, and that this second chance was a rare gift. Margaret, observing the scene with a slight smile, approached Jake once again. "Don't waste this opportunity," she said, her voice full of kindness, but also of a wisdom he knew he had to honor. "Change is hard, but necessary. What you do from now on will define who you really are." Jake nodded, his hands still trembling, not from fear, but from determination. The woman he had humiliated had become the person who gave him a new life. And this lesson would never be forgotten. David looked at his mother with a mixture of gratitude and respect. Although he was still unhappy with what had happened, he trusted Margaret's judgment. "You know me, Mom," he said, sighing. "I'll follow what you said, but I won't be complacent." Margaret smiled back. "I know, my son, and that's what will make you stronger." David turned to Jake one last time. "You start over tomorrow," he said, with a firmness that left no doubt. "And I expect you to prove that my mother was right." The relief and weight of responsibility mixed inside Jake. He had never felt something like this. A mix of gratitude, regret, and an uncontrollable desire to make things right. "I won't disappoint you," he promised, feeling the tears still present, but now filled with hope. Jake knew he would have to fight, that every action from that moment on would be watched, but he also knew that this battle for redemption was the most important one of his life. As Margaret and David walked toward the door, ready to leave, the restaurant began to murmur again. The customers, who had witnessed that deeply human and transformative scene, now whispered among themselves, some emotional, others surprised. Margaret, as she left, gave Jake one last look, that serene and wise smile that spoke more than any words. Jake stood there, motionless, watching her walk away, knowing that woman had changed his life forever. Now the restaurant felt different to Jake. The tables, the customers, the atmosphere, nothing was the same as before. He saw everything with new eyes, humble eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned one of the most important lessons of their life. And as night fell over the restaurant, Jake felt that his true journey was only beginning. He would have to prove his worth every day, not just to David and Margaret, but to himself. Jake and Margaret's story showed us that a person's true value isn't in appearances, but in their ability to learn and transform. This was a journey of humility, redemption, and empathy, a lesson we can all carry with us. If this story touched you and you believe in the power of second chances, leave your comment below. We'd love to hear what you thought of this emotional ending. Like the video so more people can see this message of hope and transformation. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this.